Good morning, everybody. This is Paul Lum with the American Farmland Trust, California region. I'm the California project manager, and I thank you for your attendance today, especially for many of us that stayed up late last night and probably checking our phones and computers today. So thanks for sitting in. I'll start with introductions. With us today is our guest speaker, Gabrielle Ludwig. She is the Director of Sustainability and Environmental Affairs of the Almond Board. And also with us is Samuel Madrigal of the American Farmland Trust California region. Samuel will manage the technical aspects of the webinar, such as the chat box and Q&As and any other technical difficulties or challenges. So during the presentations, feel free to enter questions in the Q&A box, and at the end of each session, I'll address the questions, as well as we'll have time at the end of the webinar, the final session, to answer any further questions you might have. We're going to use a chat box for internal information and items related to running our webinar smoothly. Note we will be taking a 10-minute break around 9:50, and we'll finish the webinar no later than 11 o'clock. We're recording the session today, and we plan to make the recording available upon request. So our 4-part webinar series is titled Quantifying the Economic and Environmental Impacts of Soil Health Practices. So today is our second webinar for our second part. The first part was held last Monday, October 26th. Today, we're going to describe tools to evaluate environmental benefits from soil health practices. We'll start off with a brief talk about American Farmland Trust grower case studies. And if you heard the session last week on case studies, thank you for your patience. And it's going to be a briefer, more summarized discussion on our case studies. So after the break today, we're going to talk about the environmental tools used to assess impacts from adoption of soil health case studies. We're going to talk about the nutrient tracking tool as a method you can use to determine nutrient and sediment losses from different farming practices. And in the final session, I'll introduce Comet Planner as a tool that can help you estimate the effects of farming practices on carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions. So going back to last Monday, to summarize our talks from that webinar, in addition to the case study session, grower Jean Akuye spoke about her farm's experience with implementing healthy soils practices. And we discussed the economic assessment of adopting practices that improve soil health. And that was through the NRCS level 3 T-chart as a cost benefit method. And then finally, last week, we circled back to writing a case study and some tips and pointers and advantages for writing case studies to help bring up, raise the awareness of healthy soil and farm practices, and we're trying to expand and write more case studies. American Farmland Trust was founded in 1980, and our mission is to protect farmland, promote sound farming practices, and keep farmers on the land. So here's our webinar schedule. Our future webinars include a wine grape session on economic impacts on November 19th, and a wine grape session for ag professionals on environmental impacts on December 1st. We are seeking ag professionals and growers that grow and work in wine grapes. So please refer folks that you know, any contacts you know to us, and we can add them to our invitee list and invite them to our webinars. In January, the National American Farmland Trust team is going to join our California team, and we're going to present webinars to train ag professionals on soil health tools, such as AFT's partial budget analysis for economic impact, and for environmental assessment, we'll review the nutrient tracking tool and introduce Comment Farm as opposed to Comment Planner that we're going to discuss today. And the January dates will be announced soon. So our work is supported by the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, USDA, through a grant with the Western Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, commonly called Western SARE. This is today's agenda for your reference. Like I said, we'll have our break and we plan to finish at 11. We'll have plenty of time for Q&As. The case study project goal for our webinar series as well is to scale up farming practices that improve soil health by providing tangible evidence of benefits to healthy soils, to promote the case studies to increase awareness. And the case studies we aim to publish compelling and informative handouts that encourage growers to adopt practices, healthy soils practices. So why quantify soil health outcomes? There's evidence that cover crops, nutrient management, compost applications improve soil health and water quality. There's not much information about economic benefits linked with better soil health or net profit. And farmers and the ag community want to know the bottom line. AFT has published 8 soil health case studies across the US, different crops in different states, and have published 2 soil health case studies in the San Joaquin Valley, both with almond growers. AFT's case studies, especially for California, are developed by assessing grower adoption of 4 healthy soils practices: nutrient management, conservation cover, which could be planted cover crops or maintaining native vegetation. Either way, we can assess that as conservation cover, compost application, and mulching of annual prunings. So our objectives and deliverables for the case studies: to use methods to quantify outcomes, so economic outcomes with NRCS level 3 T-charts and AFT partial budget analysis method, water quality with the nutrient tracking tool, and climate with the Comment Farm tool. We interview farmers that have adopted soil health practices and are successful at it. We publish the case studies and share that with growers in the ag community. So one of our 2 case studies published last year with Ralph Souter of Akuye Farms. He adopted 4 of the healthy soils practices that are part of our program. He adopted them back in 2004 and on all of his 116 acres at the time. He was able to show an increase in per acre net income over a 14-year period since the date of soil health adoption adjusted for inflation. To calculate and determine the economic benefit and cost analysis, we survey the farmer and obtain his costs for inputs in his farming operation. The back page of the case study includes the economic analysis through AFT's partial budget analysis method. The environmental benefit, we're using the nutrient tracking tool, and for Ralph Souter, we found a reduction in nitrogen losses over the 14-year period. And for climate assessment, we use the Comet Farm tool. So how can ag professionals use the case studies? You can help the growers that you work with by demonstrating examples of soil health success stories, provide economic and environmental evidence of soil health benefit, and encourage on-farm practice adoption. So I'll move on to the next one. How can farmers use the case studies? Growers have an opportunity to read about the experiences of one of their peers. The case studies provide evidence of soil health success, and studies allow growers to advocate healthy soils practices with landowners, buyers, bankers, and the studies may potentially provide marketing opportunities. So in sum, the case study is a grower's story of their experience with implementing practices to improve soil health and their approaches to farm management, which they can share. And we apply quantitative tools to determine economic gains or loss as a result of adopting practices. And we use a nutrient tracking tool and Comet Planner to quantify environmental impacts. So by publishing the case studies, we hope to demonstrate the benefits of improving soil health. We hope to publish more case studies in the future, and we're currently working with several wine grape growers on the North Coast. We're also collaborating with other agencies on soil health projects and staying connected with university extension, crop researchers, and nonprofits in ag research or ag outreach, all with an aim to further our goals to scale up adoption of sound farming practices. Lastly, AFT has developed a new toolkit, an economic environmental assessment guide to help folks, ag professionals and growers, write case studies, comprehensive instruction provided for using a partial budget analysis and using the nutrient tracking tool and Comet Farm, which are all components of a case study. A link to the toolkit will be emailed to you, for your review and your information. We encourage you to look at it and consider writing case studies, or consider working with your farmers on some of the tools. And further information about this toolkit will be presented at our January webinars. So thank you for listening to the first session. We have a link to AFT soil health case studies, and of course links and websites for AFT, where you can search for additional case studies that were done in other parts of the country. So at this time, I want to introduce Gabrielle Ludwig, and she's going to talk about the Almond Board's work in cover crops.
Good morning, and let me first get myself shared.
Great.
The make it full screen slide part is being hidden right now, so I'm trying to get to that GUI key. Okay, so just checking, are you guys seeing it as full screen?
You're still in the general view.
Okay. So good morning, and I'm hoping technology behaves, which, as you can tell, we're never quite sure. Appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to this presentation about some research that the Almond Board has funded related to cover crops. And I have to admit, I wasn't quite sure who the audience is. So I was thinking a little bit more about what growers are asking and what growers are caring about in terms of almonds. First, just a little bit about the Almond Board. For those who don't know us, we're a federal marketing order, so under the supervision of USDA, founded and funded by almond growers through an assessment. And what the Almond Board does is most of the funding goes to global market development, a chunk goes to research, industry education, quality and food safety, regulatory issues. And the way I like to describe it is grower dollars, and the industry makes the decisions ultimately as to how it gets spent. So we have elected board of directors, and industry volunteers participate in our committees and our work groups. There's currently about 55 employees based in California, but from marketing also in the UK, India, China, and South Korea. And I think one thing that we're proud of and that we care about is that the Almond Board has had a long-term investment in research. First research was for navel orangeworm back in 1973, and that program that started with a couple of projects is now many different projects, is a very involved system, covering everything from nutrition research to how do we grow things better in the orchard to food safety and food quality. It just gives you an overview of the committees that we have. So when we talk almonds and cover crops, you don't see a lot of cover crops and almonds. And yet, as we just heard from Paul, this is not my language, everybody and their brother wants growers to use cover crops, okay? And so the question for growers, especially in our world, is why is everybody talking about cover crops? One thing is just simply this whole conversation about soil health, about trying to use ag lands to store more carbon in the soil, and that's one of the fastest short-term ways to reduce greenhouse gases. It's also key interest for the state of California. Another area where cover crops come up is there's a lot of concern about the loss of biodiversity and to what extent can adding cover crops to the mix improve biodiversity, whether you're talking about within the soil itself or as habitat for what I'll call above ground species, insects, mammals, etc. And then the other big driver for the conversation in cover crops is soil erosion / nitrogen phosphorus runoff. And the California growers kind of go, huh? Because it's not really where the conversation is in California. That is a major conversation for essentially all of the ag between the Appalachians and the Rocky Mountains, because that drains into the Mississippi River and you have a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the major drainage that goes up into the New York State, into the Chesapeake Bay. And given that a lot of row crops are grown in that space, a lot of the major food companies have been focusing on cover crops to help reduce soil erosion, capture nitrogen, phosphorus runoff to minimize the impacts on the water. But even for almonds, this conversation is coming up more. And I think there's two things to keep in mind on that space. One is, for example, kind. First of all, just thinking about if we look at as almond production has increased, it has that increased production has been very successfully absorbed in the marketplace, partly through expanded exports, but also because of increasingly diversifying the kinds of products that almonds go into. And a key one has been milk substitute products, whether almond milks or almond yogurt, etc. Kind bars, or there's like Simple Mills that makes unconventional flours. And so when you think about the value systems of the kind of people who buy those kinds of products, they tend to be what we in our marketing world tend to call our sustainability seekers. So they tend to be people that are caring more about, they don't only want to have food that's healthy for them, they also want to eat food that's good for the world in some way. And so, trying to figure out how do we, from a marketing perspective, continue to have almonds be able to compete in that space is a key reason to also think about cover crops. And a lot of those companies do prioritize cover crops. We've had Kind Bar recently announced that they want to source 100% of their almonds from bee-friendly farmland. The key criteria for that bee-friendly farmland is the use of or having some habitat for pollinators growing on that land. General Mills has been working on regenerative ag. Other companies are. So just, this is where the conversation is. And for almond growers, the question is, well, where do we fit into that space? And to be blunt, it's not that simple. First of all, a lot of the thinking about cover crops is coming from a Midwestern, typically rain-fed agricultural system, where you're putting in the crop, you cover crop after harvest, something like that. And the models don't necessarily work they don't often work for specialty crops. They often don't necessarily work, at least as is, for irrigated Mediterranean climate perennial cropping systems. So what are some of the key differences? Well, key one is it's irrigated. You have, and typically nowadays it's micro irrigation or drip lines. So you have limited area. I always call it, you have two different ecosystems in the orchard, the irrigated part, the unirrigated part. And how they get managed are two different ways, as you can see in these pictures. So how do you deal with that? Typically, the tree row with the irrigation system is you want to keep free of other plants because that interferes with the irrigation system and water supply. Another key issue is currently we still harvest with our nuts onto by shaking the trees and letting the nuts dry on the ground. And then you use what are called sweepers, but they're actually blower sweepers to blow the nuts into a windrow for pickup. And any unevenness in the ground, straggling plants, the nuts can get hung up in, and that then either becomes costly hand labor to rake those nuts out, or they just are lost yield. So how do you have a clean orchard floor by the time of harvest? The other big worry for cover crops and almonds is frost. The thinking is that bare ground re-radiates better, and having a cover crop there in the bloom in spring may not be the wisest thing. Winter sanitation, our key insect is navel orangeworm. The key base practice for our IPM system is to come through in the winter months and shake the trees to remove any nuts that got left behind, because they can provide food for overwintering navel orangeworm. And if they're once the nuts are on the ground, they either get broken down, or if you're in drier parts of the state, you often will flail mow. Well, how do you have a cover crop and flail mow? Water. We have data, older data, saying if you've got a cover crop there in the middle of the summer, it can use up to 30% more water. That will give people that are not from California pause for a moment. Okay. At the same time, cover crops may benefit with water. And then tree crop growers are tree crop growers. They're not annual crop growers, so they may not have the right equipment. And fundamentally, at the end of the day, for cover crops to be adopted more widely by almond growers, it has to make sense. It has to provide a benefit to the growers. That investment in the cover crop has to provide something to them. And that comes back to the cost studies that AFT has been doing. So I will take some credit for encouraging the conversation about what kind of research should we do for soil health in general and cover crops in particular. And when I discussed it with the environmental committee some 5-6 years ago, they pretty much had everything you see on the left of the screen, all these excuses for why they couldn't do cover crops. And so I went to them with a question that I'm now become infamous for, is if you had a magic wand, what would your cover crop do? And they basically said, well, we'd like it to use winter rains, and if we had a magic wand, it would vanish around bloom, and it wouldn't use much water, and it wouldn't, and it would miraculously make the soil have no pests. That's the magic wand that they want, okay? So with that information, and then Amélie Gaudin, who's on the line, I believe, joined UC Davis, and I turned to her and said, Amélie, you're interested in these kinds of questions? Here's my problem. Figure out this magic wand list and make it happen. And she did, with a large team. So because as we all know, when we're talking about these kinds of questions, it's A, changing the system, but B, there's a lot of side questions. As I say, there's all these, I'll call them excuses for why it's so hard to do cover crops in almonds, yet we have everybody else saying there's all these benefits. So where is that reality or for almonds? So the team, Emily is the lead, but it includes, people working on pollination, Neil Williams working on pollination and pollinator questions, Jeff Mitchell working on water use questions, Brad Hansen working on weed competition questions. Yus Wilson got brought in to look at navel orange worm and winter sanitation impacts, as well as other pest impacts. Danny Lytle, who looked at frost, what differences having bare ground versus having a cover crop have in terms of temperatures during frost events. Amanda Hodson's looked at things like what's the shift with or without cover crops for what I'll call diversity of nematodes. Andreas Westphal has been looking at specifically which crops might either repel or somehow turn away parasitic nematodes or are hosts to parasitic nematodes that you may not want in some way. And Mohammed Yagmor, David Dahl, and May Collenber, all farm advisors or former farm advisors, have helped with taking samples, measuring things like plant water potential, et cetera. So it's really been a diverse team, and I appreciate everybody who's been participating in it because, again, it takes that kind of team to get the data together. So what was done? One of the, going back here to water, one of the key other issues is just simply the gradient in rainfall between the Sacramento Valley and the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley. So 100% of the almonds are grown in the Central Valley for United States. And you're getting somewhere between 25, 30 inches of rain in the Sacramento Valley and on average of 6 inches of rain in Kern County. So the study did trials in 3 locations, Tehama County, Merced County, and Kern County, covering that gradient. They tried to do 4 treatments, so no cover crop, bare ground control, resident vegetation, a soil building mix, and a pollinator mix. All of these were planted in the fall using winter rains. The orchards were similar in terms of having nonpareil as the primary variety and 2 different pollinizers, and were micro sprinkler irrigated. And they also looked at different termination timings and methods just to see both the impacts and how it worked. So again, just gives you a sense of what this was, a serious effort to really look at if we put cover crops in different parts of the state and almond growing, what impact does it have? And a key one, and this is something that people have been learning, what grows depends on your rainfall and soil. I mean, this is just one example, but so using the soil builder mix, from north to south, your ratios of what actually ended up growing varied quite a bit, depending on where you were. And I think this is one of the key questions that's still a hurdle for growers, is really having good information about which kinds of cover crops will work well for their particular locations, particularly with water uncertainty. I mean, it hasn't really rained yet this fall. I don't see yet any in the offing. I'm seeing a little bit of snow, but not any rain. So how do we manage that? This one, I think, is a really interesting data that Danny Lytle collected, which was frost concerns. And fundamentally, what she found was that if you're looking at the temperatures at 5 feet above the ground, whether it's above the cover crop or above bare ground, you're seeing the same temperatures on average at that level, meaning that the cover crop does not seem to be detrimental in terms of having colder temperatures, which is the fear of growers. This is a major piece of information because if you're in frost-prone areas, especially in the Sacramento Valley, this has been one major reason for not planting a cover crop or not maintaining even resident vegetation. And this slide is really cribbed straight from a presentation from one of Amelie's students. Basically what they have found, and I think this is coming back to, what growers said they were interested in. The problems that they are trying to solve where cover crops might play a role is like for helping with water infiltration, salinity, and things like that. So the results clearly showed it improved water infiltration. Like for example, the Kern County side had really compacted soil, and even though it was not easy to grow that cover crop because of the water situation, it made a difference in terms of water infiltration rates, a significant difference. Decreases in sodicity, improved soil aggregation, soil biology definitely changed when you had the cover crops present. And again, in these very compacted soils, remembering in trees, yields, things you do this year often impact your yields more in the following years. Yield trends look better where that soil compaction was dealt with. Now, realizing nothing with soils and nothing with trees happens really fast, so it took time to start seeing changes in soil carbon and or yield. Some of the other benefits, and some of them I'd say are still, well, the data may be in-house but not have been presented to us at the Almond Board yet, so others may want to speak to it. But as I say, we've been still trying to figure out what the impact of a cover crop is on navel orangeworm winter sanitation, because I think last year when they tried to do it, the growth wasn't that great. Fundamentally, the question is, nuts that are in the cover crop should have more moisture. They should be breaking down quicker, even if you don't mow them. So that's really the question that's trying to be addressed there. Weed suppression, again, it depends a lot on what you use, but in some cases, weed suppression has been seen, especially if you have sort of the lower growing, what I'll call spreading cover crops. Water conservation is still, at least I haven't seen the data yet. Generally, what we have seen from other research in almonds is once you truly improve the water holding capacity, whether it's really water conservation or better water use, but we've seen with the whole orchard recycling really clear data showing that improved organic matter leads to a better plant water status. My personal suspicion is you're getting less stress, let's say on a daily basis in the heat of the summer. There's more moisture in the soil for the tree to get to. And then the other area is, depending on the selection of the cover crop is biodiversity, so either pollinator habitat or habitat for other species. So for growers, we're then talking about, well, what do they need to think about? I think the two farm advisors, Catherine Jarvis-Sheen and Danny Lytle, put together a nice article last year that's available online, basically saying, here's the things to think about. What are you trying to achieve as an almond grower to help you determine what kind of seed mixes to try and get? Is the main focus on water infiltration or reduced soil compaction? Is it for water holding capacity, nitrogen scavenging, pollinator, etc.? And understanding how likely are they to germinate depending on the rainfall you have or your ability to do irrigation. So just letting people know there's this article out for how to think about it, but the big still to do, and the draft just landed in our mailboxes yesterday. Vivian Waters, who's a postdoc with Emily's lab, has really been working on trying to pull together all the information related to cover crops and almonds to develop an almond, we'll call it BMP guide or cover crop guide, a detailed one. And I'll tell you, even just this week, another reason for why not has come up that we hadn't thought about based on conversations about diseases that we need to then look into. So this is something the Almond Board has very specifically asked for in its funding, because we do think we'd like to see more cover crops grown in almonds, but we also understand it doesn't necessarily work in every situation. So helping growers understand how they can fit cover crops into their system is a key question now. And along those lines, incentives, the Almond Board currently actually has an incentive program going on. If grower is interested, contact Billy Sink from Project Apis M. I believe he's also online. And then, there are also the other sources for incentives, UST NRCS, CDFA's Healthy Soils, assuming they get funding this year. And the San Joaquin Valley Air District has actually had some funding in this arena, mainly worrying about wind erosion and so forth. So with that, any questions that I might be able to answer, or I may ask someone else online to answer? Hello?
Gabriel, we'll just give it a second to see if
Okay.
any questions pop up.
Thanks.
So one question that came through is, what was the height of cover crop when measuring for frost?
I don't know. The comparison in that data was basically measuring temperatures at ground level, at the bare and cover crop level, and at 5 feet above. But I don't know the height of the cover crop at that time. I don't know if.
Okay. And then another question being asked is, how have covers affected dust? And oh, having a hard time reading the second part of this question. And has that increased with mowing?
So that's a good question. So it depends on when you're doing the what's called the termination. So let me just backtrack. The dust issue really comes up during harvesting. We shake the nuts, windrow them, and then that third step of picking the nuts up, because the nuts have picked up dust. It typically hasn't rained for 3 or 4 months. It tends to be the very dusty process. The couple of things there. I don't know that we have any, I would say, good data one way or the other. In terms of terminating the cover crops, everything that was done for these studies was terminating either in the February or in the sort of March, April timeframe, mainly because once you get into the summer season, having a cover crop on the ground is going to use more water. And so that's the tension in these Mediterranean systems, is timing of cover crops in relationship to water availability. So I would not expect the mowing at that time frame to really increase dust and so forth. And the question really is do any of those remnant roots help or worsen the dust for harvesting? My gut reaction is they probably reduce, because it helps hold the soil. Having better soil structure is probably going to reduce your dust come harvest. But I don't have any data one way or the other proving that.
And there was a follow-up to that, Gabrielle, asking if dust has been reduced with winter winds.
For us, dust is a summer problem, so I'm not quite sure I fully understand the question. In the wintertime, we typically have rainfall or higher moisture levels. and it's not a time where you have a lot of activity in the orchard. So that's not typically our main dust time, but the summertime, especially harvesting, is dusty.
Great. And then there's another question here asking about whether there are estimates on what cover crop adoption rates or trends look like across almonds in California and by region.
Yes, so there are adoption rates, depends on how you define cover crop. If you're looking at having resident vegetation grow, I'd say at most 30% of the acreage has some cover crop on it. If you're looking for a planted cover crop, it's 1 to 5% of the acreage. So typically what you'll see is in the Sacramento Valley, it's not uncommon to see orchards let the resident vegetation grow in the middles, not the tree rows, in the middles, because that helps with drying the soil down, being able to get back into the orchard sooner with the wetter conditions they get in the winter time, and they tend to have a little bit heavier soils. The further south you go in the valley, in the Central Valley, the less likely you are to see a cover crop for irrigation and water use reasons. And so I think that's one of the questions that I think we are going to struggle with for quite some time, is while the outside world would like us to see use more cover crops, in a time of sigma, in a time of limited water supply or costly water, the growers are going to think long and hard about, is something that I do going to use more water? Or if we can truly show that it helps them by having better water holding capacity, that you can actually reduce some water applications, that would be a game changer, but we don't quite have that data yet, at least that I'm aware of.
Looks like the next question here is asking if you've begun analysis on the economics yet.
We have not, but as Michelle Perez can attest to, Tom Tavol and I have been talking to AFT about doing exactly such an analysis.
Then a final question here. Is there an estimate on how many almond growers are currently cover cropping?
As I said earlier, and part of Amélie Gaudin's work is also doing a survey. So we have data from our sustainability program, CASP, as well as that. Currently, the estimate is at most 30% of the acreage, and that's really based on what's happening in the Sacramento Valley, has some cover for some part of the year, most of that being resident vegetation. Planted cover crops is pretty rare.
It looks like that's all the questions that we have for now.
Good. Thank you, Paul.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me? Should
Yes.
You can hear me? Thank you very much, Gabrielle. It's very interesting and very enlightening. It just raises a point that how much the research is, how important that is, and that there's a lot of effort, a lot of collaborative effort to do more research on cover crops and other ways to improve soil and any other benefits. Folks, if you think of other questions, just enter them in and we can address them at a later time. And it's 9:50, so we'll take a 10-minute break. And I'll be here if there are any questions come up at this time. And we'll see you at 10 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks, Gabrielle. Thank you very much. Break. American Farmland Trust wants to thank Gabrielle again for her very informative presentation and for being able to participate with us. So for the rest of our webinars this morning, we're going to discuss tools that assess impacts to soil and climate from specific farm practices or combined farm practice scenarios. And at this time, we're going to talk about USDA's nutrient tracking tool. It's used to assess nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment losses from farm practices. The purpose is to show that practices can improve soil health, that practices that do improve soil health result in reductions in nutrient and sediment losses. And we hope this instruction will help you evaluate how farming practices affect soil and water quality, and ultimately provide you with an assessment tool to share with growers. This is the home page of USDA's nutrient tracking tool. It is a straightforward, simple to use program. So we encourage folks in the ag community and growers to open the program up and experiment with the farm inputs. NTT was developed to simulate farm management impacts to watersheds, farms, and fields. The model encompasses lands across the US and incorporates national data for weather, groundwater conditions, and farm management regional area in regional areas, and inputs typical of regions assessed. So here's a list of conservation practices evaluated by NTT's program. They are NRCS conservation practices. This is the NTT Home Page, the sign-in page, and notice the button on the lower right portion, presentations. There's some good tutorials to help guide users and provide information on the data entry process. So the first step is to create a field map. I created a hypothetical almond orchard scenario called North Orchard. It consists of 40 acres and it's 15 years old. And the program shows the soil types in that location. And the grower can enter soil phosphorus, either part per million or from a soil test. I assume I did not test for phosphorus. It lists organic matter content for those soil types as organic matter in a baseline typical farm practice scenario. In other words, not heavily composted or cover cropped, but more of a standard farming practice for the region. The next page shows the soil characteristics in layers, including bulk density, texture, organic matter percentage, pH. And again, these are assumed values, baseline values for a field that was farmed in more of a conventional management program. So here's the data entry. I'm using year 7 or 7th year of the orchard at a time when no healthy soils practices are implemented. And there are the fertilizer and irrigation inputs and dates and amounts of fertilizer in value 1, the amount of water applied. For simplicity, I'm entering irrigation every 15 days, 3 inches. Of course, a more realistic entry might be weekly or every 5 days with a lower amount of water. And the user could enter NRCS conservation practices. And I've used this program enough times to learn that if there is a a conservation practice on the farm, like a grass waterway or a wetland, be sure to confirm the accuracy of the acreage, and that, for instance, the acreage of a grass waterway is going to be separate from the acreage of a crop field. So here's the operations page for year 15. I used year 15 to show a time when the orchard was farmed with healthy soils practice adoption, and at a time when soil health improved over a few years to the extent where fertilizer applications could be reduced due to increased due to a few years of compost and contributions from improved soil health, and thereby decreasing nitrogen applications, decreasing potash applications slightly. And I'm entering those practices, the healthy soils practices, in this table. The top row showing solid manure, so composted cow manure, 5 tons an acre, and I think there's a carbon nitrogen ratio that's entered. And then the cover cropping, barley and crimson clover mix. There's not a lot of selections available, so I've just basically put, entered the an approximate mix of barley and crimson clover, and then the rest of all the operations that are done in the orchard that year. And this is a screenshot. It doesn't include, the entire list or all the tasks that are performed in an orchard. So the summary report is produced, comparing the 2 scenarios for year 7 and year 15. Year 7, I just called the North Orchard. Year 15, I called the N Orchard year 15. And due to the practices and reduction in nitrogen application, we show a slight decrease in nitrogen losses. And so it doesn't look like a significant decrease from 2.31 pounds of the acre to 2.07. But that, that translates to a 10% decrease. So there is some significance there. Sediment loss is a much greater increase from 0.39 tons an acre in the baseline year, year 7, and 0.23 tons an acre in the baseline year 15. And I don't see this, I think, if I recall, that's about 40%. So we encourage growers and the folks that work with growers to use this tool. It's very straightforward, very user-friendly, and easy to change the inputs, try adding different practices or subtracting practices, remove the compost, reduce or add more cover cropping, basically find scenarios that are practical for your farm management. And you can make this comparison as to, improving nitrogen loss. And phosphorus is not a big factor in California, but irrigation changes, and due to the irrigation data entries and sediment. So, this is a summary report, but it's helpful to see to quantify the effects based on the data that that is entered based on your actual fertilizer applications and water inputs, compost and cover crop inputs. So here's a breakdown of nitrogen and the row for total phosphorus, total other water, total sediment. So for instance, nitrogen and broken down to organic N, runoff N, subsurface N. There's no tile drain N in California, but it shows the breakdown that comprises the 2.3 pounds an acre. So it provides a little bit more detail, and it can be useful. So we encourage you again, play with the scenarios and inputs. You'll find that the results will vary between farms and locations, and depending on soil type and operation inputs. The tools and methodology to determine nitrogen losses based on farming scenarios and adopting soil health practices. It's a different approach than the nitrogen management plans required by growers to determine crop nitrogen requirements. But we're promoting the tool to help growers better understand how their practices improve water and soil quality and improve nutrient cycling, reduce sediment loss. It could be a companion piece or supplemental information for a grower as they use the nitrogen management plans to guide their farming. So we hope it's a useful resource that you can share and share with growers you work with and demonstrate the value. On this page is the nutrient tracking tool link, and we do have time for questions if you have any before we go into the next session. We have a little bit of time for any questions or discussion.
There's a question, Paul, asking, for water especially, the underlying change in water use is based on the differences that are input, or is there some underlying algorithm that calculates a water use difference?
No, it's based on the farmer's inputs based on improved water holding capacity or water infiltration that derive from, say, some of the soil health practices like compost or cover cropping, and so it's some of it is observational and intuitive because the grower's not making or taking a lot of measurements on parameters. But we have talked to a lot of growers that feel that the water requirement does decrease once they start cover cropping or adding compost over a number of years to improve soil tilth and basically improve water holding capacity.
Another question, does this take into account the quality of water applied if you had high mineral water, or mostly inputs and practices?
It doesn't take into account as far as water applied, but the grower might use some of the nitrogen values or nutrient values in water and revise or decrease his fertilizer application, and he can enter a decreased value into the program.
That might be all the questions that we have for now, Paul.
Okay. I will continue. Right. we'll go on to the last session. Let me click here. Now I'm going to introduce USDA's Comet Planner. And this tool estimates greenhouse gas reduction from specific ag conservation practices. Its purpose is to provide a basic assessment of carbon sequestered at the farm or county-wide level. And for California growers, Comet Planner is the method used in CDFA's Healthy Soils Program, or HSP, to determine program payments based on greenhouse gas reduction values related to practice adoption, healthy soils practices. So California's Comet Planner is developed by USDA NRCS and CDFA. And growers that apply for HSP funding utilize a program and enter the types of inputs and data needed to produce the greenhouse gas findings. So we encourage you to run this and experiment again with different scenarios. Just like the NTT, it's really straightforward. It's a basic, easy to use, user-friendly program. So this is the home page. Google Comet Planner -CDFA. Be certain to select the California Healthy Soils option, and which focuses on California crops and typical farming practices for our state. And like NTT, there's an instructional video link to help users navigate the program. So Comet Planner is not to be confused with USDA's Comet Farm. Comet Farm determines climate benefit at the field level. It's more detail oriented, and we're going to provide instruction on using Comet Farm as part of our webinars in January. Okay, the next page, the user enters or selects the ag system. In our case, it's an orchard or vineyard instead of a cropland or grazing land. And conservation practices pulled up by default, practices related to orchard and vineyard farming. And so you see the conservation practice standards. These are NRCS standards associated with NRCS program payments. So for our example farm, I am selecting compost application with a carbon nitrogen ratio of greater than 11:1. And I'm selecting planted cover crop with the choice is a legume, a grass legume mix. There are a few other options. And nutrient management. So the nutrient management is basically utilizing or applying high efficiency fertilizers and blends and micronutrients to reduce synthetic nitrogen by 15%. So the example would be reducing UN32 or CAN 17 and perhaps using a UN32 and ATS blend with micronutrients. That simply an example, but it's a way to provide the data entry that's realistic to a farm. So the next page shows the total CO2 equivalent. CO2 equivalent, carbon dioxide equivalent in metric tons equivalent per year for each practice. You may not be able to see that screen, but the practices again, compost application, cover crop, and nutrient management over 40 acres. And we see carbon dioxide sequestered 251 metric tons. Nitrous oxide, an increase. And I don't see the final one, it's methane, but it's very it's an insignificant change. The significance here is the program calculates the compost application as a significant contribution to sequestering carbon. And the far right are the NRCS payments associated with these practices. And of course, the grower needs to be eligible and can review the tool to gauge eligibility and meeting the criteria, and also with budgets. So this page shows emission reduction coefficients, or the components of carbon, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane in much greater detail as affected by each conservation practice on a per acre basis. And here's the report. Once the data entry is completed and the values are confirmed, this report is produced, and the final report summarizes the findings associated with each practice. And again, on the far right, the estimated HSP payment dollars. So that is it for Comet Planner. It is not a cumbersome, time-consuming effort to produce the findings. And so a quick read, and we encourage people to use the program. EPA has developed a greenhouse gas calculator, excuse me, which equates the carbon sequestration to terms and values that we could relate to. I'll show you on the next page, but this first page, we simply enter the carbon dioxide equivalent from Comet Planner. And for our farm, it was 245 metric tons. And the equivalence shows, this is a screenshot of partial page, but for instance, the equivalent of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from reducing passenger cars driven for 1 year, on the far left, 52.9 cars driven for 1 year removed from the road. So I think folks could relate to that. One I like is carbon sequestered by tree seedlings grown for 10 years, 4,051. So, and the web page features a lot of other examples, such as number of car miles driven, acreage of forests, to name a few. But the calculator puts the climate benefit in terms that we can grasp and relate to and remember. So, final slide. Thanks for sitting in and hearing about Comet Planner and EPA's gas calculator, greenhouse gas calculator. To recap today, we reviewed AFT's case studies and talked about the Almond Board's work with cover crops and their research. And we discussed the nutrient tracking tool to evaluate water quality impacts, and discussed, and just recently, Comet Planner to assess climate benefit. So it's our hope you can share some of this information with growers and others in the ag community to increase awareness of farming practices that improve soil health and also benefit climate. So before we go to the final Q&As, I want to mention that our upcoming webinars will focus on, again, on ag professionals who work with wine grape growers, and we're seeking attendees that are in wine grapes kind of broaden our net and broaden our attendee group. And these webinars will be November 19th and December 1st. We'll be sending out announcements. And in January, of course, we'll be hosting webinars to talk about Comet Farm, which is the more comprehensive version of Comet Planner. And we'll introduce AFT's partial budget analysis, which is also more comprehensive. And I think it'll be very useful to folks due to the increased accuracy of the analysis of those tools. We recorded the sessions today and we'll make them available upon request. And also we're going to send out an exit survey for you to fill out and return, which we would really appreciate. So we do have time for some Q&As. Feel free to bring up any questions, or if you think of questions later, I'm available, and farther down the line, I'll be available for one-on-one sessions to answer any questions or to help folks with the tools or economic analysis or with any technical help with farm management, with crop farm practices and improve soil health. I'm hearing none. There's the web page for Comet Planner. Well, I really appreciate your attendance. It's a busy, hectic time yesterday and today. I'm sure all of us are going to go back and check the election results. So we look forward to hearing from you or seeing you at our future webinars, and keep us in mind as far as extending or sharing our webinar information with folks in wine grapes.
Hey, Paul, I think we have a question here.
Okay.
So it's asking, how can we help folks understand to what extent either the nitrogen or Comet tools account for specialty crops / Mediterranean climates / irrigation, etc.?
Well, Comet Planner is for the California Healthy Soils Program. It's somewhat limited in specialty crops, but the general Comet Planner that's used, not designed for the Healthy Soils Program, is broader, and it has more options for different crops. I would encourage the user to open up the program and take a look at the selections. There are choices for different management, cover crop management, and so I think that would be a place to start. It's a nationally based, the Comet Planner, so a lot of diversity across the country, and I could help further. If you would like any assistance with that.
That may be all the questions for now, Paul.
Okay. Thank you for attending and for your interest in our programs and for supporting American Farmland Trust. See you later. We'll be in touch through emails with the survey. Thank you.